Welcome to those who are just logging in, and thank you for joining us for the 13th instalment of our Geothink and Learn webinars, this one on the evolution of open data in Canada. I'm Sam Lumley, a Master's Researcher in the Department of Geography at McGill University with the Geothink grant. For those joining us for the first time, Geothink is a partnership grant funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Along with 30 international partners and over 100 students, Geothink investigates how the GeoWeb is shaping government and citizen interactions. The project is led by Professor René Sieber at McGill University. I'm going to begin the session today by welcoming and introducing today's speakers. First of all, our convener for today's session is Geothink co-applicant Peter Johnson, an Associate Professor in Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. His research evaluates how new geospatial technologies influence communications and information sharing between governments and citizens, identifying emergent adoption challenges and constraints. Our next panelist is Dan Murray, who is the Director of Technology, Innovation and Services at the City of Kitchener. Dan has worked in information technology for close to 20 years, and more than 17 of those have been with the City of Kitchener, holding various roles and leading numerous technology initiatives. Next up, we have Jean-Noël Landry, who is the Executive Director of Open North, Canada's leading non-profit organisation working on open data and open smart cities. Open North works with parliaments, governments, media organisations and non-profits and many others. And finally, we welcome Patrick Loiseau, who works for the City of Montreal. He's an Innovation and Open Data Advisor for the Montreal Urban Innovation Lab. This lab is in charge of applying the open data policy inside the City of Montreal. And just a final note for everyone, that the entire webinar will be recorded for future use and available at our website geothink.ca and on our YouTube channel. You can ask questions during and even after today's session via our Twitter. And with that, I'll pass on to today's convener, Peter Johnson.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam. And thank you to our panelists for making themselves available for this. I think this is a wonderful way to sort of cap Geothink. As you all probably know, open data has been a major focus of Geothink, so it's nice to spend some time right now to reflect back and think a little bit about how things have changed in the 5, 6, 7 years that we've been working on these topics, and to think about also where open data has to go and potential sort of dovetailing with concepts of open government as well. So I have a couple slides here that I'm just gonna share and go through quickly so that we can get to the discussion. There we go. All right. Okay. All right. So first off, I mean, many people who are on this call, I just took a quick look at the participants and also the panelists as well, are deeply immersed in civic tech, right? And how that technology is being used for the public good, sort of broadly. And I think that now, compared to a few years ago, we think more and more about the changing expectations from citizens. So what are citizens expecting from government? Not simply background service provision, but a more leadership role in delivering things like digital services. And I like this image that I have here, this sort of the comic cartoon image, the street mix, everything being sort of funneled into the mobile device that the citizen can use to interact with things like court dates, bike lanes, 411 type of municipal notification to help them interact with government services in different ways. However, as we've discovered through open data, there's this tension between those traditional government gatekeepers, the collectors of data and those repositories, and then also private sector data users. And this is something that has caused many of us to reflect deeply on sort of what's the role of government as data creators, owners, stewards, or users, or potentially other types of models that might still be around. So I just drew a quick fun little diagram here. So this is kind of like what I would think of as being the traditional model of open data provision. So we have the provider, which is our municipal government or provincial or federal government, providing open data to a community of users. And we can think about maybe how this is starting to change as private sector or NGOs or even other governments start to intervene in between that sort of that very linear type of connection. So to get something a little bit more like this, right? So we have this host of intermediaries who are coming between the data providing open government and the users. And so sometimes there's not really any connection between the users or the citizens and the government that's actually delivering the open data, but rather they're interacting with government data through this intermediary layer, right? And that intermediary layer could be something like Google Maps, or it could be an NGO, or it could be any other type of entity as well. So trying to think about, what is the role of government in providing open data, but what is the role of government in ensuring that that data is used for the public benefit? And that's kind of the list of questions here that I sent out previously to our list of panelists, thinking about the evolving world of open data. And in the Q&A, we'll try and get at some of these questions as well. But generally, sort of how has open data changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years? Are there promises or expectations that are still unmet? And then what does the future hold for open data? Will open data still look like a data portal hosted online, or will it look entirely different? I think there's some fun places to play talking about these ideas, and also I also welcome the audience as well to chime in with your experience and your thoughts on these as well. And so with that, I think I'll start off with our next panelist. Is it Sam? Can you remind me who's the next panelist? I can't hear you.
It's
okay,
me.
John away. All right. So okay, take it away.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for the intro. I think that really sets the stage for some big questions that are very much top of mind for the open data community, if there is such a thing as an open data community, or if we're talking about open data communities where data is starting to become more open. I think that's one of the kind of challenging questions that we're facing right now, is the coherence of the community itself, aligned around a set of principles, of course, but how do we engage with one another? And it's been nice to see how over the years, to reflect back on the evolution of open data in Canada, now I get invited to events that aren't labeled as open data conferences, but we're now able to position ourselves to be able to talk about the value added of open data to help resolve complex issues and different kind of problems that different types of stakeholders are facing. So that's one indicator that we're seeing. But I want to take a little bit of a step back to kick us off today, because I think that the evolution of the open data kind of community or open data in Canada has also had an impact on the way that organizations and institutions have transformed themselves and shifted. And so I'll speak more from a kind of a bit of a self-reflexive kind of way, in the way that actually the evolution of open data in Canada can be seen through the shifts and transition that my organization, Open North, has actually undergone itself in its own role, in its own mission, in its own kind of like service offering. So I'll point to a couple of examples of that, and then I'll share some like key maybe kind of successes as to Canada's kind of leadership in the open data space, and then ask some critical questions as well, because I think it's, if we talk about open data in Canada, given that the open data community is a global movement, I think it's important also to situate Canada vis-a-vis some global trends, and I'll share that as well. Okay, so let me kind of kick it off in kind of pointing to some of the things that Open North used to do, maybe 6-7 years ago, and how that has shifted and what we do now, right, as an evolution of ourselves. So initially, Open North used to provide a lot of advice on policy and licensing, right? So a lot of cities, a lot of governments were preoccupied by establishing a policy framework or a normative framework in order to facilitate the reusability and the accessibility and sharing of public data. So, getting in touch with a number of different organizations internationally, for us, it was really important to know what are the standards. What does a template policy look like? What are the Creative Commons licenses that we should be promoting? So that was like basic research in order to set the kind of legal and reusability terms. That conversation has evolved quite a lot, and over the last couple of years, we've seen the International Open Data Charter gain momentum in Canada. There's been a few governments that have adopted the charter themselves. But there's also been a critical thinking around the principles themselves. And key principles that I think are being challenged or questioned a little bit is the whole notion of open by default and publishing with purpose, right? So shifting from everything should be available if it doesn't compromise, personal information and national security or public security issues, and then moving towards, I think, a model that you described, Peter, which is a much more kind of context kind of specific understanding of the users of data, so that we don't just kind of push volumes out, but we actually understand and develop engagement processes to be able to understand the needs of the users and what data and what format at what time, so really kind of much more kind of hands-on kind of context-driven approach. We used to build open data websites, like we helped build some of the first ones in Canada, but now, the infrastructure of open data, I think is around the quality of data, and then making sure that those publication processes become much more automated, right? And so for us, it's less about building portals than actually making sure that, alert systems are put in place for those users, really kind of putting emphasis on approaches to user engagement, and then viewing data as public infrastructure. And I think that's been kind of a shift in how we name and talk about open data, is that open data is not only a public asset, but it's actually, we should be looking at open data in the same way that we look at different investments that are made for public roads, for example, really kind of like as the backbone of our democratic system and the way that citizens are engaging with their governments, right? And so once you start looking at that, then there's an investment that ought to be made. We used to organize hackathons. We don't do that as much. We're much more interested in, or much more focused rather, there's still a place for hackathons, but we're much more focused on kind of these kind of multi-stakeholder governance issues, so that it goes beyond government, but it actually looks at complex kind of urban problem framing and understanding, well, what data is currently available that may not be known to potential users that could have a use for that data. What data is not shared, which could be shared, and how do we name those types of issues in order to kind of move along a much more nuanced data spectrum from, which traditionally went from closed to open by default, and now we're looking at that kind of like gray zone and the complexities of, shared data for whom, within an institution, within an organization, or within kind of dynamic kind of stakeholder groups as well. I think, like when we set off to work on open data, roughly like 10 years ago, there's a lot of stuff that we were hoping that we would be working on that we're only starting to work on now. And kind of data interoperability is one of them. So we spent a lot of time working on open data standards, did a lot of research, developed standards ourselves, including Open 511 and others. But now we're actually, for example, working with MISA Ontario, so the Municipal Information Systems Association in Ontario, and looking at how do we actually develop a methodology that enables us to prioritize so-called top priority data sets, and then look at those data sets in detail and look at how do we even align at the level of definitions. And that the normative or ontologies of data is like one of the key steps in making sure that we're naming the same things. And once you start kind of doing that, then you need to develop an appreciation for the context of those who created those standards in the first place. So we're kind of, there's a trust, I think, that's building in the open data community and the evolution of open data in Canada that enables us to kind of, speak openly about the needs of different publishers of data, and recognizing that, well, if we put ourselves in the shoes of users, there's a lot of vested interest in making sure that data can be reused and accessible in a similar format across different jurisdictions, laterally and horizontally as well. And I guess the last thing that I'll say, and I'm really not getting into, I guess I'll address, the questions as we take, as we engage with participants today, is that we were more focused around tool building and creating kind of supply and demand. And now we're much more focused on what we're calling kind of open smart cities, right? So situating openness in a broader discourse that raises a lot of different types of issues around kind of the ethics of data governance and kind of risk management on openness itself. So I think the open data, the evolution of the open data kind of community has now kind of broadened to a bigger discussion around openness writ large across different sectors, across different types of institutions. And that implies a lot of different kind of, really potentially sensitive kind of topics, which we may or may not have been good at kind of naming explicitly from the get-go when we first started doing that. Talking about kind of, data sharing and data privacy and protection of, personal data. Those were issues that we were aware of, but now we see that coming to the forefront. So we may have been able to we should have probably done a better job to kind of anticipate, the kind of ethical implications of openness in a way that I don't think that we strategically wanted to do that because that would have created barriers to engagement and momentum and leadership. If you start talking about the problems as an advocate or as a lobbyist on open data, well, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because what you want is actually having governments adopt more policies that align with one another. But if you start saying, adopt a policy, but just be mindful, this may create a lot of problems for you. And, that wasn't a good kind of advocacy strategy, but now we're kind of having to circle back to those issues as well. So I'll stop there, and got plenty more to share, but let's move on.
Thanks very much. And next up, we have Patrick Lazo.
Yes, so thanks everyone for showing up today. I'll be brief. I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion afterwards, but I decided to make a sort of a background of what's been going on in Montreal with open data. Montreal started its yes, obviously we have an open data portal, and everything started back in 2011. It started with some influence from outside of the city. I was at the City of Montreal in 2011, and it was mostly of a work in progress in 2011. It's sort of trying to convince everybody, explain to everybody what was open data. And the coming years that followed was mostly, I would say, a artistic program more than a functional program, so that it was mostly people saying like it would be nice to have this data set and trying to talk to the department to convince them to open it. And so in 2014, the new administration that came in created the Smart City Office, and in 2015 that Smart City Office published the Smart City Action Plan, and open data was a main pillar of that action plan. So the point was that if we wanted to make Montreal a smart city, we had to make sure that we also had a proper open data program, an open data portal, and also making sure that people are able to use that open data to also contribute to making Montreal a smart city, a smarter city. So 2015, we changed the open data policy. We had an open data policy that mainly said that we were respecting the Sunlight Foundation principles. So 2015, we moved to a open by default, and that was a big game changer for people inside of the City of Montreal, because prior to changing that policy, opening data meant that you needed to convince somebody that he should be opening his data and that he should be making it available to others to be used. Starting 2015, the coin got flipped, and now we needed to explain to people that the data is open by default, and now you need to make sure that you're opening it, and that if you want to find a way to, I would not say find a way, I would say if you are having a reasons why we shouldn't be opening it, then we will be working with you to either check for privacy issues or information that could be an issue with public security or stuff like that. So that helped us a lot. So when people start thinking about should we move to a open by with purpose, I always say that open by default should be the main point of talk, and open with purpose is sort of like directing which should be the next data sets that are going out and how do you work with it. Between 2015 and I would say last year, the main issue for us and most of the work was mostly done around making sure that data is high quality, updated, and well documented. It's still an issue for some organizations, making sure that the data that goes out is of quality and can be used. We had to remove some data sets from the portal because prior to having the open data program with the Smart City Office, there was a lot of data sets that were simply dumped on the portal with no information other than a title. So trying to make sense of those data sets was quite complicated. So we replaced most of them, but it's still an issue to making sure that we have a good quality of data when we publish them. We also put a data inventory on our data portal. So anybody that wants to ask us for more data sets is having an inventory makes it simpler for them. And it also shows to everybody what's our roadmap for coming years. And last year, we also transitioned to a urban innovation lab. So we're not the smart city office anymore. We're a urban innovation lab. And that's where publishing with purpose comes in, is that having a data set being useful to outside the organization, useful for employees inside of the city comes in, is that instead of simply publishing data and waiting for somebody to use it, we're trying to focus mostly now on data sets that are going to be used the second we put it on the portal. And just for coming months, we're currently working on a new open data action plan, and we're looking forward to sharing it with the community, because having an input from the outside, but not simply an input, but also having people contributing to how open data is being done and what should be done as a community base, having more people doing more of a civic tech use of open data makes it a lot easier for us afterwards to keep the program afloat and making sure that people are still going forward with open data. Just a quick mention that the City of Montreal also contributes to Donner Quebec. That's a big evolution, and it was one of the main ideas here in Quebec. A lot of cities don't necessarily have the technology or the manpower to have an open data portal. So having a one portal for the Quebec government and cities makes it a lot easier for onboarding of cities in Quebec. And it also makes it easier for people that are looking for data sets in Quebec to simply go to this one portal and doing research and being able to look up for data sets. And on our side, for the cities, it also forces us now to work together to normalize the data sets, making sure that we have standards in place and that we're working to have more a more uniform use of those data sets. So that's one of the big main things that we're doing together on this venture with other cities and the Quebec government. So obviously, if you want to send us an email or talk to us on Twitter, feel free to do afterwards. But obviously, I'll be on the talk to talk with you about the questions you have. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And next up, we have Dan Murray.
So I'm pleased to be able to be here today. Glad everyone could join us. What I want to do is give a sense of what our evolution as a municipality in Ontario has been. Really, for Kitchener, we were probably a little bit late to the open data game. We were, municipalities around us were certainly ahead of us in getting open data portals deployed. But for us, it was really the desire of our senior management team to approach it from an open government context and build it into policy and codify what we were going to do. So we actually had an open government initiative that started in 2013. I noticed on the attendee list that Yuri Konga is joining us today. Yuri was a big help to us to help guide that work as well. But we really pulled a cross-functional team together from across the organization to talk about what open government meant to the city of Kitchener. And really there were three outcomes that came from that. One was an updated accountability and transparency policy. Every municipality in Ontario is required to have a policy that governs their accountability and transparency initiatives. Ours was due for renewal, and it seemed like a perfect opportunity to weave open government into that policy. The other was a vision around what open government meant, and really we developed a 3-year action plan on how to move that forward. Open data was one of our first priority issues for that. So you can see on the screen the vision and framework that was developed. Really, the open government program was around being accountable, participatory, and transparent to the citizens, And we were going to do that through accessibility, innovation, and collaboration. And obviously technology is a big part of how we would deliver on that. Just before I jump to this, so there were a number of accountability and transparency commitments that were made for open data, and those were really codified in that policy. So one was open by default. We were probably one of the first to actually adopt open by default. It was kind of at the time where the term was around. Kitchener had always had a pretty open and transparent operating model with citizens, so we felt it was something we were comfortable doing. We did not expect that this meant everything was going to be open immediately, and certainly it's been a process, but I think that was something that was unique that we did. Also, the accountability and transparency policy mentioned things like the importance of prioritizing data releases based on what the community was looking for. Machine readable, that's normal. Updating it in a timely manner. So, you know, road closures versus election data. Election results, once every 4 years, you put them out, they don't change, but road closures can happen. You have a water main break and you need to update that immediately. So trying to come up with a way to make sure that those are updated in a manner that's appropriate based on the information. And the other thing that it noted was that we need to be flexible and adapt to any changes that are occurring within open data and what the community is looking for. This graph I really just threw together with limited information I could find in terms of how many data sets we have. We started with 32 back in May of 2014. You can see we're able to jump up a little bit over the course of the next year, and it flattens out, and then we gradually have a higher slope. So, you know, we've gone from 32 to 164 data sets, but I think what's really interesting here is looking at this in terms of what was happening in our organization. So when we launched, we picked the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, like the GIS layers that we already had, that we were custodians of. And really, as we started talking to people and telling them what open data was and promoting it, that we were not getting a whole lot of traction immediately. So I would say the next, after a year when we jumped up to 60 data sets, we were really looking at information that we had that we were already providing, but we were able to convert into a machine readable format and make available. So these are all things that helped us say we're putting out layers. But I would say where we really started to get the traction is in around the August 2016. We put out a new portal with APIs and really started to get some visibility to our open data. But through the discussions over those years with internal staff, this is where we really started to see data sets coming from them where they wanted to actually get them up. And this has been, hopefully that line continues. Certainly we see we were able to go out and start getting information from our utilities, our water infrastructure, and these are all layers that people thought were too dangerous to put out. What would anyone want for it? But we started to realize as we put this information out, consultants and people that were working with us could easily grab that data without staff intervention, and then we're making sure that they're actually using current data, which is helpful. Just jumping forward to some of the wins. So really we have reshaped our thinking on the data that the city has. I mentioned the self-serve approach. So we're not trying to sell our data anymore. We make it available. The consultants, everybody can get it as they need. They're able to use that and produce better products in the end. Another thing we were able to do was we were able to consolidate our open data portals with the entire region. We're in an area with a number of cities and a regional government. A lot of people in this area don't know where the boundaries are. So for us to be able to put that together in one location where they could get open data for the entire region, it's also allowed us to be able to hold conversations on making sure that we're doing that in a consistent manner where we can. We have staff using open data for their own purposes. So this really opens it up for them to know what we have and also be able to use it at will without having to contact IT and work through others to get that information. Technology support is increasing. We use Esri products. We continually see things coming that are helping with the furthering of open data. And one thing that we've done is we started using our own open data for storytelling. So a lot of the time, people don't understand the services that municipalities provide. We've done story maps using the Esri product for things like our election results, for our water infrastructure. We've done some for our neighborhood development offices. So it really helps tell the story, and we're using our own open data, which has already been vetted, which makes it very easy. Some challenges, we still don't really know how our open data is being used, and that's something that would be great. We love to know that. That leads into the next question about what data is wanted. We really want to be able to hear from people what they're looking for. Standards have been mentioned. You know, that we adopt them where we can. For us, our open data programs are run off the corner of a desk. We don't have staff dedicated to it, so it's largely what can we do with the limited resources we have. Automation is important as well to make sure that we're able to get data out in a timely manner. And we've had some areas where things like zoning layers that we haven't been able to release because of our licensing. And just quickly, where do I see things going? Standards, I really see those being adopted where there's a benefit. So GTFS is a good example for the transit feeds. You know, that's been adopted because there's an immediate benefit in putting it out in that format. Google will pick it up and use it as other vendors will. APIs being built into solutions, Smart Cities Initiative will always lead to more data. And I think the other thing that's probably, I'll jump through here, but the other area that I see a lot of benefit coming out, some agencies haven't even begun an open data journey yet, really around police forces and health agencies. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I can see that growing in the future. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll jump off here.
Okay, so thank you so much to all our panelists for some really, really interesting presentations. And thank you for everyone who's posted questions so far. I'll just remind that you can contribute by asking questions or adding to the discussion through the Zoom interface. So you can use the chat box or you can raise questions through the Q&A button. Failing that, you can tweet at GeothinkCA and ask questions through there. And so for now, I'll pass over to Peter Johnson, who's going to lead the Q&A session.
Sure, great. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so I've been following closely the question and answer panel here and trying to shoot off a few answers. But one question that's come up in a couple different forums, and maybe Patrick and Dan can speak to this, is open by default. And have there been any issues as a result or challenges as a result of the open by default policies? And maybe about how that either conflicts or is complementary to this idea of open with a purpose. So maybe we'll start with Patrick, answer that in like a minute or two, and then maybe Dan can chime in if he's got some other things too.
I would say that open by default didn't get any challenges from inside of the city. I think that it was made as mostly saying that this is the new way of working with open data for the city of Montreal, and that there was a couple of exceptions. So the obvious ones were around making sure that we're protecting the privacy of the citizens and making sure that we respected our contracts, stuff like that, public security. And so it sort of made it more clear why we're opening. So I'm saying that we need to be open. That's like the main reason why we're going with open by default. I think that the questioning that open with purpose brings is that it's nice to open everything, simply saying like build it and they will come, but not always. Some data sets may be easier to put out, but are not useful or not being used. So I think that my perspective on it is that we keep the open by default for sure, and the open data policy right now, it's there, and we'll be keeping it for sure. And the open with purpose is more of a way of saying how should the strategy be done. How, instead of doing a priority of simply voting on saying like, yes, it would be nice to have this one, it's simply saying that opening with purpose is saying like, we have this project that the community is working on, or we have this NGO that would like to have access to that. And it's already being done that way, but open with purpose is simply putting the words around how we're opening it. My simple answer, I would say.
Okay, great, thanks. And also, I noticed in the chat there, Jean Noé linked to an Open North report on open by default as well, so attendees can check that out too. Dan, if you have anything else to comment on?
Sure. Open default hasn't really been an issue for us. You know, I think people struggled a little bit with the concept at first, but it is codified in our policy in terms of the accountability and transparency. Everyone agrees with what was put in there. We have actually made that open by default is owned by our records management office. So we really don't see it being in conflict with anything that we need to do from a legislative perspective in a municipality. It did take time. We haven't gone, you know, run into areas and said, give us all your data. But what we're doing is approaching it with that lens. So unless there is a reason to not publish it for you know, a legal or a privacy reason, then we have to have a conversation and really get at what are the concerns with it. We have been able to move people past that, and I think it's been a good good thing to adopt early on, and it's helped us really cement open data and really open government within our organization.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, it gives your organization something like a policy to point at, right?
Yep.
That sort of idea. Okay.
Can I jump in, Peter, just
sure.
on the open by default? I mean, I think there's like two key things here that may or may not be kind of somewhat contradictory, right? And I think it's important to kind of name the relationship between those two, is that in principle, open by default is not something that governments or the public writ large would disagree with, right? And so it's an attractive and an appealing kind of concept and a policy goal. I think it's when it's if open by default is applied to a city's broader data management systems, it can allow better internal data sharing as well as improving access to information for citizens. But at the same time, we're also seeing that open data does not, and whether it's open by default, does not automatically create more data, a more data literate public. And so, you know, there's like, again, I think it goes to the tension between publishing with purpose and open by default. It's like, you know, when does, and I'm just referring to another comment that was made in the chat box here by Yuri, it's like, what is the end state? Well, open by data, in my mind, is an activity, not an end goal. We'll never complete this endeavor. We're never going to be done with openness or open data itself. And so I think the activity, it needs to be defined, and that's where we get into kind of developing strategic frameworks or playbooks and roadmaps, right? Collaboratively with stakeholders internally. And once you start kind of talking to them internally, and I know we've got two, you know, colleagues from different cities, it's the moving the open data conversation away from, well, this is something that maybe if I have time, I'll do on the side of my desk, to kind of really changing the culture of how we actually talk about data management internally.
Right. Great. Yeah, no, that was a provocative question from Yuri on there as well. Dan or Patrick, do you have any comments about this end state for open data within the context of open government? Is there like a finish line?
So I would agree completely with that. There is no finish line, and I think it is a journey. We've committed to it. It's part of our policy, and that's going to guide how we work going forward. As new systems come in, there'll be more data created, and we've got to look at that data and decide, is there something that is of value and that we can release, and that we have no reason not to release. We collect this data, you know, we're as part of the city that the residents have paid for us to do. If there's value they can derive from that, we have to make it available. And that's really how we've approached our open data.
Okay. Yeah, Patrick?
Yeah, there's no finish line. The funny thing is that when I joined the Smart City office back in 2015, I was thinking to myself, 2-3 years, that's going to be done. So 4 years later, I'm sort of saying like, yeah, I can retire on it almost. But no, there's no finish line. I think it's and it's also changing. We're at the beginning of it. When we're looking at how things are done inside of the city, how, for example, we're mentioning open by default, open with purpose, but there's also open by design, which is a concept where you start building your systems with an openness already in mind, instead of simply saying like, okay, we built this new system and we'll put a open data extraction afterwards. So figuring out ways for citizens to have access to information, access to the data from the get-go and not as an output at the end. So those are concepts that my colleagues inside of the city and the other departments cannot look for or are not thinking about. They're simply doing their jobs that were asked for and their mandates are done to. My job is to remove the snow. My job is to make sure that the parks are clean, that we have new lampposts, stuff like that. So we're there to help them, consult them, make sure that they know the question that you should be asking. People inside the transportation office here in Montreal now make sure that when they do contracts with other companies, is that the way the architecture is done is that the data is always open from the start, so that the technology that's being used by the transportation companies is interoperable, making sure that if we change vendors, the data is still available and the next vendor will simply use the same data. So things like that are in progress, and that's the new way that things are going on. So maybe 10, 15 years from now, we're sort of saying like, oh, it's the way we're doing things now. But for now, there's still people that needs to have somebody inside of the city making sure that they look for those questions, and also make sure that the community can have a word on saying how we're collecting data, on making sure that we protect the privacy, stuff like that. So no, there's no finish lines for us.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm combining a couple questions here, but there's been a few questions about the value of open data, both internally, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, both internally within your organization, but then also the value to citizens, right? And whether there is actual demand from citizens for open data. Is this something that citizens are asking for? Is it something that people within government are asking for? Is it something that private sector organizations are asking for? And how do you balance the costs of providing open data with the value derived by these different communities? So maybe we'll start with Jean Noé, if you have some comments on that. You talked about it a little bit in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that there's still inadequate evidence of impact. You know, even after like 10, 15 years of doing this, it's very, very difficult because of, you know, some of the core tenets of the open data community. And that goes towards, well, we make data sets available, and then whoever wants to reuse it at no cost can do so as they please. But whose job is it to then trace back and kind of understand what was actually done? And so there's been with that data. So there's a big challenge there. It's and so in terms of the understanding the value, the public value of opening up data, it creates complications when you talk to government leaders, because they don't necessarily have those engagement tools to connect the dots between the actual uses of data outside of government and even inside government. You know, so let's not forget that. It's like breaking those silos internally, and we facilitate, you know, focus groups inside governments and public administrations. And sometimes during those focus groups, you have connections and kind of like haha moment where it's like, oh, you can do that with that data, or you have like, oh, that context is quite interesting. So even facilitating spaces to exchange within government about the reusability and potential of data and the competencies that exist inside of public administration is needs to occur. Yeah, I'll stop to that.
Okay, great. Patrick or Dan, do you have any comments on the value? Like, are there, like, other than sort of ad hoc examples from community groups or private sector organizations? I know that, yeah, Patrick?
Yeah. I think like Jean-Louis was mentioning, sort of looking at figuring out how to evaluate the value is complicated, but we did a sort of like a recap of the last 3 years on our blog at the end of 2018, and we were looking at stats, and we have a ticket system, and it's been working since 2016. So we had around like 2,300 requests, emails, tweets that came in over the course of almost 3 years. And those are mainly coming from outside of the city, but also from inside of the city and from other organizations. So we're starting to see that even inside of the city, it's a lot easier for people to simply say, we're looking for this data set, and they're not going to the other department. They're asking us to find out where the data is, because they know that we have the best view of things going on inside of the city. And it's other organization. It's Hydro-Quebec that is using our data for knowing when trees need to be cut around power lines, stuff like that. So there's a lot of use like that are hard to document, but we're seeing things going on, and we know that the value is there, that people are using it. And that's the main reason why open data needs to happen, needs to be done, and needs to be going on.
Okay, great. Thanks. Dan, you got a quick comment there?
Yeah, I would say that understanding the value of what's being used has been a real challenge for us. We've been able to, I would say, see the value from our own purposes, like by being able to put data out on our portal that we used to have to provide to consultants. We're saving time by doing that. And the use that we're using it for our own purposes, we do not have a good, clear sense of how it's being used and what value is coming out of it. And I'd say that's one of the big things that would be helpful for us to really keep momentum on it. We love hearing from people, and it's actually helped us be able to explain how data is being used and actually open up some sets that we wouldn't have thought we would have been able to. So if anyone out there is in the community, by all means talk to us and let us know what you're looking for. That's our mechanism at this point of finding out what people are interested in and what the value they're getting out of it is.
Okay, great. So we're just going to bring Renee Sieber in for a comment here, I believe.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I want to ask the panelists about citizen engagement and how that has evolved over time. We often talk about citizen engagement in a very market-oriented way in terms of public services, but I think that it's useful for us to reflect on how engagement for governance and accountability has changed over time.
Okay, so sorry, the question is, how are citizens involved with this discussion about data, such as like what data to release or how data is used? Is that what you're getting at, Renee?
Hi, it's not just how citizens are engaged in order to make requests of data sources, but engaged in issues of accountability and transparency.
Can you give us an example?
I brought it up in the chat that governments are risk averse for good reasons and not good reasons. Governments are risk averse because they don't want to reveal data that could impact privacy, for example, or national security. But governments can also refuse or constrict the kinds of data that are released because they might possibly reveal malfeasance or corruption.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a fine line there, right? Like, I don't necessarily want my municipal government releasing like detailed information about, I don't know, or like health data, right? Like, I don't really want the Ontario government revealing, personal health data about me. And I'm sure that that's regulated, or at least I hope that that's regulated somewhere, right? That there's a policy protecting individually identifiable data. And I guess as a part of that, then there would be data that a government could suppress, right, about expenditures or other sorts of things like that. So I guess, I mean, anything's possible.
Patrick, Dan, Jean-Noé?
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think when we talk about citizens, it's also like, what are we actually talking about, right? When we start like kind of segmenting like the notion of citizens and residents, and there's a whole bunch of different types of issues to kind of categorize and understand, digital capacities and awareness and understanding, and even notions of accountability and transparency for different types of citizen kind of subgroups would mean different things, right? And so I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is as we reflect on the evolution of open data, is that from a capacity perspective, from a data literacy perspective, which fundamentally, if you want to be able to enhance the capacity of citizens to use data for accountability and transparency perspective, there's an assumption that they actually can understand the data in the first place. So we're still trying to address data literacy issues, whereas the data conversation, I think, has shifted towards kind of AI or algorithmic transparency. So if we thought that we were, facing a big challenge in raising kind of data literacy skills for citizens, how about developing AI literacy for citizens? Because that's where data is being used right now in ways that actually has a direct impact on, the allocation of services and from a transparency and accountability perspective. So I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but I think it's important to just like be mindful of, not just inclusion issues, but actually really doing the hard work of building networks that enable us to understand who are those intermediaries, who do we need to turn to have a more kind of nuanced and sophisticated understanding of what we mean by citizens in that conversation.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, I think having good policy and procedures within your organization will help to, if you're able to put that in place, it doesn't matter what the political climate is. If it's following that, you should be able to break through and remain accountable. I'm coming from a municipality. We don't have a lot of high tension issues in Kitchener. I think stepping out of open data and just even going to engagement, our largest engagement that we've ever had for an issue was around backyard chickens, which is probably a good thing. But we do struggle to get engagement from the community. Certainly from an open data context, we don't have a large civic tech group here. There's one that's starting now, and it seems to have a bit more emotion than what we've seen in the past. So we've struggled with that from the open data perspective, but even just getting comments back on our annual budget and programs and so on, we keep putting the effort in. So we're not pulling back because we're not getting citizen engagement from it, but we just need more issues like chickens, and we'll keep people engaged.
Thanks, Dan. And seeing as I live in the neighboring municipality that outlawed backyard chickens, I can relate to that. Right, that was a big deal in Kitchener-Waterloo a few years ago. So, kind of building on this, one of the questions that came up was the relation between open government and open data, and is the government going to do more than data? So, Dan, you've talked about that a little bit, but maybe Patrick or Jean-Noé, if you have other comments on and Jean-Noé as well, about being more than data, right? Talk about literacy, data literacy, and is open data really just a small part of this broader discussion of how to generate citizen engagement and buy-in on various issues? Maybe Patrick, we'll start with you if you have some comments about the Montreal case.
Yeah, like I was mentioning, we're currently working on a new open data action plan, and we're trying to figure out what should be included and what should be also maybe not necessarily strictly open data. I think having an open government perspective on a thing is the best way to go. So I was saying, like, open data is not simply a feature of open government, and making sure that when we're looking at how the government, how the city is working and trying to be more open. How does open data fits in? How does it provide maybe the basis for exchange between citizens and the city? That's something that we're seeing more and more here in Montreal when there's a big announcement, and there's sort of now a reflex of saying what open data could also be released related to this subject that makes sure that people know what are currently the issues and what's happening. So right now in Montreal, there's an issue around availability of housing and making sure that housing are up to standards and the people that are living in those housing. So there's work being done right now, and there's open data that goes with it, making sure that people can know where there's currently fines being given out, where there's currently housing that the city knows that there's issue, and that the city is trying to make sure that the owners of those buildings and those apartments are doing their job to keeping it up to standards, stuff like that. So yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Jean-Noé or Dane, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just a quick note. I dropped a link in the chat for everybody. It's the Open Government Partnership, the main kind of global network of governments and different types of organizations internationally as well as locally, convening in Ottawa in May, at the end of the month in May. There's a call for proposal there, so definitely encourage folks who are listening in to pitch some ideas for that. I think it's really important for Canadian engagement to be strong for that event. But I think to the question there, I think it's also that the data space itself is getting broader, right? So when we talk about open data, like the open data community, because it has such a solid understanding of data issues, it means that with many more themes that are in need of attention, there's also new actors and issues crossing the boundary between open data and wider data policy. And I think that's where we see kind of that evolution now kind of stepping into an open government kind of framework. So the open community may be at risk of losing energy in and of itself as a, but the need to strengthen networks and links between open data and other open agendas is becoming more and more prevalent. And we need to focus on how to strengthen open advocacy within the wider data landscape itself. So data is always going to be part of the open government conversation. And I think open data advocates really have an opportunity to kind of, step maybe outside the kind of traditional mold and kind of, develop kind of new relationships and kind of new partnerships with folks that are also talking about data, but that don't necessarily have that kind of core principled and values-driven approach to talking about data, which is increasingly valuable and urgent.
So it's just building on that, Jean-Noé, and kind of pulling in some of the other questions that have been asked. What about when we move from thinking about open data, so data that's created by governments in their process of providing services to citizens, to thinking about open government, which would maybe include other data streams. So like private sector data, like through Strava or Uber, that are made available or purchased by city governments, but used under the umbrella of improving decision-making around transit or recreation facilities. Maybe if that's something that has been encountered in either Kitchener or Montreal. I don't know if Patrick or Dan, if you have any comments on how your respective city governments are incorporating private sector data sources or crowdsourced data into your operations or decision-making, if that's a factor or not. Maybe Patrick, we'll start with you.
So I think the best example that we have in Montreal is Waze. 3 years ago, we joined I can't remember the exact name, but Waze has a program where governments can partner with Waze to have access to the crowdsourced data that people put through Waze. Obviously, the way that Waze structured the contract makes it that we get access to what people will put in the app, but we're not allowed to publish it. It's Waze data. And in exchange, Waze asks us for data sets, but the only thing that we offer is open data sets. So when people were asking like, what can we have access to the data you're giving to Waze? And we're saying we're simply pointing them to the open data portal, and we're not giving them much more than that. I think that for now we don't have much more examples other than that one, but crowdsourcing data is something that's going to start popping up more often. We currently don't have a structured way of including those data sets, for example, on our own portal. It's something that we're looking at, but we haven't figured the recipe right now, because there's obviously issues around making sure that the data was collected properly, making sure that the data was collected legally, stuff like that. So, but we're interested in partnering with organizations, companies that are collecting data and are open to sharing them, but we don't have it as working right now, but looking forward to it.
Okay, great. Dan?
Yeah, so we don't really have a whole lot of examples of crowdsourced data. We are part of the Waze program as well, so that would be the one that we have. I think where the opportunity for this will come forward, though, is in more of the Internet of Things and smart city initiatives. We start collecting information from devices across the city. I can think, for example, we've got our streetlights that have the controls in them, and part of that is a temperature sensor. There's no issue in providing that out. We could make that type of data available, and to be able to provide that level of data for research purposes or weather or what have you, I can see others doing the same thing, and that becoming a collective data source that could add more value in the long run. So that's where I can see that coming up in the future.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Dan. And actually, I know the city of Kitchener this year has switched with sidewalk clearing reporting being a, wait till you get a call about somebody not shoveling their sidewalk and then send out enforcement, to people being allowed to to being proactive, right? So that you have inspectors who would presumably drive around and inspect key intersections to see if they've been shoveled or not. I think that's like an example that we're all familiar with living in Canada about sidewalks being shoveled, but it's an interesting, I think, conceptual change on government's perspective from being very passive in the background, waiting for citizens to complain, to being proactive and going out and making sure that before citizens encounter that friction point, that's already been done, right? So I think that's a nice kind of switch.
Yeah, and I wonder, if people start asking whether we need to start publishing the bylaw infractions for that sort of thing, that could be a little contentious, because there are privacy issues with that as well. But yeah, interesting concept.
Yeah. Okay. I think that we're getting the red flag here from Sam that our time has come to an end. I don't know if there's any last minute comments or questions. There's still a few open questions here as well. Sorry for all those questions that we didn't get to. Hopefully we addressed them in a indirect way at the very least. But I'd just like to thank our panelists for making themselves available and some really great conversation. I really, really appreciated it. And thanks to Sam for organizing this, and to Geothink as well for hosting it. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this. Do you have any final words, Sam? Or?
Yeah, so thanks very much, everyone. Sadly, we have just about reached our time. So I'd also like to add my thanks to all of today's panelists for their really interesting contributions, and also to our attendees for joining us and fully engaging in a really interesting discussion. So I'll just add that the next Geothink and Learn will be in February, with the date to be confirmed. So keep an eye on our Twitter and our website, and we look forward to seeing you there in the future. And just a final reminder that today's session was recorded. So if you have friends or colleagues that weren't able to make it along, the full video will be uploaded to our website and our YouTube channel very shortly.